Welcome. I'm Jeff Goldfarb, chair of the Democracy Seminar, the host of today's event. The Democracy Seminar, a worldwide committee of democratic correspondents, is a project of the Transregional Center for Democratic Studies of the New School for Social Research. We consider the pressing problems democracy faces today, considering ways of opposing the authoritarianism around the globe. Our correspondents include people from East and Western Europe, North and South America, Asia, and Africa. Today, we are considering problems in the United States that have implications far beyond our borders. We have a conversation with Claire Potter on her book, Political Junkies, From Talk Radio to Twitter, How Alternative Media Hooked Us on Politics and Broke Our Democracy. First, let me introduce Claire Potter. She is a professor of history at the New School, a prolific author of articles and books, sometimes addressing specific scholarly publics, but sometimes the general public, often both simultaneously, thanks to her distinctive qualities as both a very fine scholar and writer. She's an experienced online intellectual, first with her legendary blog, Tenure Radical, and now with her Substack newsletter, Claire Potter's Political Junkie. And between those projects, she became and still is the co-executive editor of Public Seminar, which I created, my baby, which now is in Claire's and Jim Miller's very capable hands. That is to say, Claire is also my dear friend and colleague. We met in an exchange of notes about a public seminar piece. One thing led to another, and we became collaborators. And now it's my honor and pleasure to host this discussion. Claire will start the discussion with opening remarks for about 15 minutes. Helena Chmielewska-Szlajfer, an assistant professor at Kozminski University in Warsaw, Poland. David Greenberg, professor of history and of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. And Nicole Hemmer, associate research scholar at the Obama Oral History Project at Columbia University, will then discuss the book with her, drawing upon their expertise in media, the politics of media and the media of politics, each offering a short opening response to the book. Then the four of them will have a discussion, which I will moderate. As the discussion proceeds, I invite you, the audience, to ask the questions and make comments in the question and answer function. I will weave your questions and comments into the conversation, perhaps also adding my own remarks. So now, Claire, please.
Jeff, thank you so much. And I want to thank you, Jeff, for organizing this event, and Lala Pop, who has made everything happen, and our friends in IT who get us all going on Zoom. I also want to thank the respondents, Helena, David, and Nikki, for taking time out of their day to join me in talking about this book. I actually want to be specific about how Jeff and I met, which was on Facebook. And what is astonishing about that is that we worked at the same university at the time, but there had been no real life space that had brought us into meaningful contact. And so I want to introduce that at the beginning, because Political Junkies offers sort of a dark view of what happened to the alternative media landscape because of the internet. And I want people to remember in parallel that there are things about social media that we value and that actually continue to be useful to politics and generative and are not fully destructive. So one of the difficulties of writing this book was to hold both things in my head at the same time. Under what conditions was alternative media creating new opportunities to open up public space for voices that had not been heard properly? And I would point to a moment in the pre-internet era, the 1960s, when the alternative press flourishes in the United States, bringing women, gays, radical anti-war activists, anti-nuclear activists into a sort of common conversation. But you can actually even move earlier and look at the 1950s, and this is something I've learned a lot from Nikki's work, which is the ways that post-war conservatives carved out alternative spaces to be heard, not just in print, but on the radio and on television. And, you know, by the 1960s, you have people like Jerry Falwell in the 1970s sending videotape around the country by mail to be played at television stations, right? So there are ways before the internet that people are carving out these openings, these spaces that new technology makes possible, that are as exciting as the internet itself. I want to sort of roll back a little bit and talk about the origins of this book. I mean, this book took shape in my imagination in that one pager that you send to an agent you don't really know, who you're trying to get interested in your work, right? And for those of you out there who are interested in writing for a broader audience, that's a skill, is to put together, say, this is my book in one page. And what I drew on for that one pager was an experience I had in 2016, the fall of 2016, during the presidential campaign, in which Trump and Hillary Clinton, of course, were faced off in a national debate. And I found myself there with an iPad open, my phone open, my computer open, and I was working on 2 social media platforms at once, and, you know, watching the debate and responding to people online. And I was engaged in sort of all of this networked activity, but doing something that I had done since I was 8 years old, which is watch politics on television, right? And so in the middle of all of this, this woman jumps into my timeline, and it's a video of her giving me the finger. And, you know, one of those memes where it's like the, you know, the finger just sort of dashes out at you over and over and over again. And in the middle of all this frenzy, that brought my mind to a screaming halt. You know, under what conditions would a complete stranger be able to give you the finger in the middle of a debate? And so I began to think about what this environment had actually contributed to what I was watching on the screen, which is this impossible man, Donald Trump, who was becoming increasingly likely to be president, something we had never imagined could happen, and that he would do that on the back of social media. So when I was sketching out this book, that's what I wanted to investigate, was how did this happen? How did we get this outcome? How did the internet as an alternative media form become so important in politics that somebody who controlled the narrative on social media could in fact control the outcome of an election? And my editor, who is a PhD historian from Harvard, so he's always thinking, can I sell this? And also, will this book last? Said, Claire, you have to push it back decades. You have to go all the way back to the origins of this. And the more I investigated it, the more I realized that that was the case, that social media had been built on a platform of other alternative media forms that had extended and receded and sometimes mimicked mainstream media forms. Now, I also want to say that Political Junkies is not the first time I have looked at media and politics. My first book was about the FBI's war on crime in the 1930s. And the central question I was investigating was, how was it that politicians like Franklin Roosevelt made arguments in the media that they couldn't make in the political sphere? And how did they assemble support for their policies by generating enthusiasm through fictions, right? And so one of the things we know about the 1930s is Americans were very suspicious of an enhanced national policing presence, but they also had access to more media than they ever had before. Comic books, movies, radio, and so on. And so I brought that sensibility to Political Junkies. How do you make arguments in alternative media that actually seem impossible in the political sphere? And by doing that, make those arguments possible, right? And I do think that is the long arc of Trumpism from the sort of, you know, McCarthyite stirrings of the post-World War II era to our present. It's that things become possible when people believe them. And they don't necessarily have to believe in them as practical or reasonable or ethical or moral. They simply have to believe that they exist. And alternative media becomes a place to make that happen. So that's part of the explanation for why I needed a long history. And I think the other reason I needed a long history is that there are lots of things that people say about the internet, but they don't know why they're true. Okay, so one of those things was always, well, Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone of I.F. Stone's Weekly was the first blogger. He was the person who really established the mode that became blogging. Why do we think this? We think this because his granddaughter said so on her blog, right? So she had a blog in which she would write obsessively about her grandfather. And one of the posts she wrote was, my grandfather was obviously a blogger, just like me. So people sort of picked that up and ran with it. And it was like, well, why? Why do you think that's true? And so my first chapter, I thought, had to be about I.F. Stone. And that's where I kind of set up the pattern of the rest of the chapters, that the alternative media expert is in fact an expert. It's somebody who has learned the rules of the game, but been marginalized from the game and is trying to get back in it, right? So Izzy, for example, lost his job at the beginning of the 1950s. And he lost it in part because the progressive papers he worked for became financially non-viable. But he also lost it because he was a pain in the ass, right? Izzy had worked for the Nation for years. And Frida Kirchway, who was possibly one of the most politically embracing publishers in all of New York, when Izzy came to her and said, you know, I've lost my newspaper jobs, can I come back to the Nation? She said, absolutely not. You know, I never liked working for you. And, you know, and so Izzy can't get a job. And that's when he figures out that if he does a 4-page newsletter every week and he gets 1,000 people to pay him $5 a year, he can live on that. You know, $50,000 was a lot at the beginning of the 1950s, right? And so he puts this little ad in the New York Times saying, you know, your favorite columnist, I.F. Stone, is starting a weekly newsletter, and all you have to do is send me $5 and you'll get it. And in the ensuing weeks, not just 1,000 people wrote in, 10,000 people wrote in, 20,000 people, and they began to grow. And it was not just Americans. People all over Eastern Europe were writing and sending him what they thought was the equivalent of $5 in whatever their money was. Japanese people were writing in. So he's getting all this money, and he realizes that it's possible for one journalist to activate an entire audience. He also realizes that he can do something that other newspapers can't, which is completely devote himself to one subject and research it thoroughly, and that can be done in government documents that are available to anybody, but the reporters don't use because they're always trying to chase the latest thing that happened this morning, right? Okay, that sounds very familiar. And the reason I'm spending so much time with it is that becomes the pattern for alternative media over the next several decades, which is somebody who is an expert in something, whether it's someone on the New Left, whether it's New York radical feminists, whether it's Robin McNeil at public television. They are an expert, and what they're able to do is convene a focused conversation for a particular segment of the audience that's eager to know. So when Robin McNeil launches the NewsHour in 1974, 75, part of how they advertise it is they say, watch the evening news and then come to the NewsHour to watch us discuss the news of the day with experts, right? And so that's the second theme in all of this is experts, that alternative media provides a platform for experts who are not necessarily anointed by larger political, economic, social institutions. Okay. And finally, I think what I would say is that all of these pre-internet moments lay a platform for the rise of the internet in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And of course, we don't have the internet as we know it until 1995. But there's something new about the internet as well. And it's not just participation. It's the idea that everybody should be free to participate in whatever way they wish to do so. Okay, and here I think it's important to emphasize the nature of early internet architects, which is they were by and large libertarians, and they were utopians. And one of the things they believed was that the more people who get to talk, the more democracy there is. Okay, so they actually take the alternative media sensibility, which is, organized around experts that are outside institutions, and they expand that and say anyone can be an expert. You come onto a bulletin board, you can do your own research, like Izzy Stone, and those early bulletin boards are full of research done by ordinary people. Similarly, bloggers become famous because they do what Izzy does. They're often people who are lawyers and bankers and ordinary people sitting at home. And by the 21st century, they are challenging journalism head on for the authority of the reading and listening public. Okay. Now I will conclude now because I want to get to our other guests and what they have to say. But I would also say that people often mark 2008, the Obama election, as the turning point for the successful use of social media. And after that, everything gets worse, right? I think that's wrong. The first person to successfully use the internet is John McCain in 2000. He's the one who gets on camera and actually answers questions from people as they are giving money to him. He is answering questions live. McCain, really sort of banked his entire political life on being the guy who says what he believes and who was accessible to the people. By 2004, Howard Dean is using that to mount an outside candidacy for the Democratic nomination, which is spectacularly successful in one sense and then implodes with astonishing speed, a speed that actually we can recognize today, right? Something goes wrong and it goes viral and he's dead in the water. But the other thing that happens in 2004 is Ron Paul runs a campaign, Libertarian Ron Paul. And Ron Paul's campaign, which he then runs again in 2008, becomes the basis for the Tea Party. So if 2004 is a turning point at all, it's a turning point in two ways. One is that the internet becomes institutionalized in insider politics. And what has to happen is the candidate appears to be an outsider, right? A candidate who is usually an insider gets to portray themselves as an outsider because of the internet. But the other thing that happens is the kind of conservative organizing that was going on in all kinds of other non-digital ways. Experts bring that knowledge to bear on how they're going to use the internet and how they're going to collect money from the internet. So, people like Richard Viguerie, who were doing direct mail back in the 1960s and getting $2, $3, $4 from people, what he really wanted was their addresses. They didn't even need their money. What he needed was their addresses. But by 2004, that is being deployed in two ways. One is, yes, they really do need the money, and it's the only way to get it, and it's the only way to break the hold of major donors on the system, but they also want the data. They want to know where their voters are, and they want to target them. And that's really how we get to 2016. And I will close by saying that when I began to write this book, I believed that Trump's Twitter was more important than just a bully pulpit. I believed that it was actually a way of gathering data as to where his pockets of support were, right? And that in fact turned out to be the case. Okay. And so as we sort of turn to a future where, we're in a moment of real democratic crisis now, where thank God the Biden administration survived the attack on democracy. And yet these tools continue to undermine the very idea of democracy by spreading wild rumors and untruths. So I think, at this particular inflection point, I'm glad that I was able to provide a history to tell people, how did we get here? Because it's not possible to throw out the internet now. What we need to do is reform it. And we need to spend more time thinking about what are the ethical uses of the internet for politics, how to use it to build democracy and not destroy it. So I will stop there and turn it over to the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, very much for a succinct overview of the project and its origins. And I had forgotten that we actually met on Facebook. So that's intriguing. Now I have to actually make a confession to the audience that we were enjoying, the panelists and Claire and I were enjoying our conversations with each other so much that we didn't actually agree on the order of the commentary. So if no one objects, I'm going to go in the order that they appear on my Zoom screen. So ask David, then Nicole, then Helena to offer their comments. Is that all right, panelists?
Okay. Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, it's my pleasure to comment and my pleasure to go first. I'll try to keep my comments succinct. This really, Political Junkies, is just a wonderful book. The combination of the historical depth, the analysis of media and how our social media and current media work, and the political insight, it's just rare to get that all together in such a good narrative too. I had the pleasure of reading some of it in manuscript, and I remember thinking, this is, Claire is doing something different, something special, something interesting in reading just the beginning of, I think it's chapter 6 on the net roots, which begins with John McCain and his penchant for making anti-Asian slurs, stuff that was said commonly among the soldiers in Vietnam, but, as a presidential candidate, it was much more problematic, but that how this became an issue on the internet bulletin board, soc.culture.vietnamese. I didn't know there was such a bulletin board, but the idea, that these alternative news sites or news outlets or news forums become a kind of force, because some of the criticisms that germinate there then do reach out to the bloggers and do actually, get heard in the mainstream media. This is really what the book is about. That's like one little illustration that shows it in microcosm. And I think one of the things I'm going to basically offer sort of two points of praise and 2 points of critique that I'll try to keep in my 5 minutes. So on this, I would say one thing the book does so wonderfully, Claire, is that you integrate, here it's an Asian American sort of news feed, discussion forum, but elsewhere it's queer history, feminist history, not as sort of standalone, sort of separate, but woven into this whole story of many kinds of alternative media and alternative and cultures and voices, subcultures and voices that aren't heard from typically, or weren't heard from typically in the mainstream media. And so how they have sort of elbowed their way in, so that the history of alternative media is, under Claire's explication, this very, a much broader history than we often get of even the recent past, because it's not done through the top-down lens of, what has been a fairly Washington, centrist, white male, certain political take. It actually includes all these different voices. So I think the way that that is integrated into this story is just magnificent in that instance, many others. I think also the other really key insight of this book is this linkage of how the rise of these alternative media have gone hand in hand with this development of the populist politics. And in that sense, too, the 1950s really is the place to start, because that's an era when we don't particularly think of that as a populist era. And to the extent that there are these populist voices, I mean, McCarthy can be seen perhaps as a populist figure. They're very much in reaction to the mainstream, and their forces sort of pushing hard to sort of tamp them down and sort of drive them out and insist this is not legitimate. And over the years, we see sort of a breakdown of the traditional media, of the gatekeepers, and the alternative media become the channels through which these populist voices enter. So the first of my points of critique gets to the idea of populism, because I think that what we mean by populism has changed over the years. I mean, there's some purists, I don't think we hear too many from these people anymore, who, once the term started being used more widely, protested that it should be used only for the People's Party of the 1890s and so on, and that populist shouldn't be applied to Father Coughlin or McCarthy or any of the other movements that, say, Michael Kazin showcases in his terrific history from the 90s, populist persuasion. But it was also in the 90s we saw that term get really watered down. Michael Kinsley had one column where he sort of says populist just comes to mean popular, and it's used in ads for pickup trucks and blue jeans. It's every politician in some way tries to claim the populist mantle, and just like they all claim the outsider mantle, it really becomes just any form of railing against Washington, railing against elites in the name of the people, which is something that pretty much all politicians are doing by the late 20th century, early 21st century. I think with Trump, and to some degree Sanders, but if Sanders is in your example, you could look at really hard left populist figures, whether Maduro or AMLO in Mexico. We see, no, this is populism. We see with Trump a kind of hardcore populism that is really, anti-trade, really hyper-nationalistic, that makes kind of all the soft populisms of all the other Republicans who ran against Trump in 2016 look, like just political marketing. And so maybe we could talk in the discussion a little bit more about, has what we mean by populism changed? How do we understand populism now? Did our understanding undergo some kind of shift in, the last decade or so, along that, Trump's rise being a symptom of that? And then the final, also maybe kind of a similar point of a term for discussion that I'll throw out is political junkies. Terrific title. We're all political junkies here, I assume. I have to say, when I first saw it as the title, I wasn't sure it's the right fit. To me, political junkies suggests, and actually these people are here in the book too, but it's, the hotline, this sort of 90s faxed newsletter, which again is in here, 538 today. To me, this is where the political junkies go. But these people, the people who tend to go to those websites, today websites, previous news sites, we don't think of as partisans. We don't think of as Izzy Stone or Richard Viguerie. These are sort of technical, data crunchers. They're interested in the mechanics of Washington, of the inside baseball stuff. And it's a kind of different strain of political junkiehood from the characters who predominate in political junkies. And they aren't populists, you know, they're something different. So we might talk a little bit more about how that strain of political junkie fits into this story and how it maybe complicates the, I think, generally plausible equation or relationship between the alternative media and the rise of this alternative politics. I'll conclude my remarks there and look forward to what Helena and Nikki have to say as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. So Nicole?
Great. Well, I will keep my comments short as well, because I'm really eager to get to the conversation that we're all going to have. You know, when I was writing my first book, I thought a lot about the ways that our media and our politics are constitutive of one another, that the values embedded in one are embedded in the other. And that was certainly true at the middle of the 20th century when you have, you know, the practice of objective journalism occurring at the same time that you have this technocratic bipartisan politics in the United States, and that they reinforce one another. And so we can think of these alternative media as a challenge, not just to objective media, but to the politics of the time, and thinking about what we have wrought with the media we have embraced, what that has meant for our politics, and how they've kind of constituted one another side by side. So how much of our investment in alternative medias or in new medias and new technologies have shaped our politics, and how much of our politics shaped the way that we use those new media. But I think that critique of existing journalism and existing politics is so important for recovering what Claire was talking about at the beginning of her comments, which is recovering the upside to a lot of this, because there has been, you know, rightfully probably a lot of attention paid to the downside of alternative media and the ways in which, as Claire says in her subtitle, it broke our democracy. I too was also drawn to thinking about political junkies as the title. I had in mind certainly David's use of it, right? The kind of wonk or political obsessive who is actually a political operative. But I actually think it's a really interesting and useful title in a lot of ways if we pay attention to the junkie part of it. Like, what is it that people are getting addicted to? And I think that this throws our attention to the audience as opposed to the creators. And you know, there are a couple of different things. There's the emotionality of it, which too is a criticism of the kind of objective journalism, journalistic practices of the mid-20th century, that there's so much emotional connection and emotion that gets spun up through the forms, the technologies, and the messages within these alternative media. But there's also a kind of knowingness, right? That you get the real scoop, you get the real news, you get the real sort of inside look at how politics works if you read these alternative media. And I think that too is something that is addictive, this idea that you have a look, access to a kind of special knowledge. And it is no wonder too that conspiracy theories can thrive in these spaces, because that's a similar kind of addictive emotional knowingness. I would also emphasize the connection between the consumption of these alternative media and identity. This is something that I talk a lot about in my book, in thinking about how consuming conservative media becomes part of the conservative identity in the United States. And once it becomes part of your identity, it becomes something that you're not only emotionally attached to, but that you feel the stakes have risen quite a lot. So if we think about the kind of ride or die politics that we have today, that we have to think about the ways that emotion and identity are implicated in that, and how those are embedded in these alternative media that we're talking about, as well as the performance of politics. And I think that's the thing that is possibly, we can debate this, possibly newer about the internet-based and social networked alternative media that we get to in the second half of the book, that we perform our politics publicly in a very different way, because we're not just consuming these media, but we are participating in them and creating them in ways that are somewhat different from the early days of the I.F. Stone newsletter, which now that we're in the days of Substack, I realize it wasn't a big thing when Political Junkies came out, but man, does it sound like the same business plan as Substack. He really cracked into something there. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave my comments there because like I said, I'm eager to get into the conversation. But I also just wanna add my kudos on to David's. It's just such a wonderful book and a real joy to read and a timely read as well.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Now we will turn to Helena, who gives her perspective from Warsaw, Poland, in the spirit of the Democracy Seminar.
Thank you. So I'm not going to say anything new here. I love reading this book, so I'm very happy I had a chance not only to read it, but also to comment on it. So I'm just going to throw in a couple of things here. And actually the first thing and the last thing that I want to throw in is pretty much a quote from the book, because I think it's a really important question to ask. And the question is, asked by Claire. It's a quote from one of the old school journalists, and the question is filtering undemocratic? Because I guess this is the essence of this entire conversation that we're having now, and I'm also very glad that your editor told you to give the backstory, because I really loved reading the backstory of the state we're in right now. Also because I am right now writing my own book on online politics in tabloids. So this is also very much up my alley. So I was also very happy to see Nick Denton mentioned of Gawker and many other blogs that he started. So a couple of things that I wanted to point out that I guess are moving the book and also our conversations, whether this be the United States, Poland, and other places around the world that are kind of struggling with web-aided populism. And this basic thing is the tension between the truth that is uncovered by such as you said, media experts, or media amateurs, political junkies. And this truth is deliberately hidden by different sorts of elites. So this can be political elites, this can be media elites, as for instance was the starting point for Gawker. But this is this notion that something is being hidden from proper, regular citizens. And here comes the political junkie and offers this truth. And knowing this truth is in the interest of citizens. When we can debate whether this was in fact true at all, we can also ask the question whether this is not turning even more kind of explicitly into uncovering and manipulating different bits of news as a political weapon to achieve political goals. So it's not the truth that is the goal, it's a political goal that is the goal. And we can see that a lot in the recent political campaigns in different places in the world. It's not the truth that we're looking for for political victory. And another thing that I wanted to point out here is something that was quite illuminating for me when I was reading your book, is these affordances that are given by different technologies in disseminating these different types of news. So the first thing that now we see in the online version, so mailing addresses. So before the zip codes that you write about, and now our email addresses. I mean, this is key, and we can see, well, this is so old. I mean, we have a new technology, but the principle is the same. Radios, I mean, you had to have all those people in the cars. That's why talk radio is so important in the US, less so in other places in the world, because not every place, as in the US, has this huge culture of having people spend hours in cars in their daily commute. So of course, this is a perfect place to actually turn on the radio and listen to something. Also, the most current affordance, I would say, from the point of view of technology, so social media that you just have in your pocket, it's simply easy. So I guess it's really important to kind of remember that the technologies are not only enablers, but the shapers of what is available to us also in terms of politics. And the last thing I wanted to point out is this, I also call it a technology of performance online. So I guess this is also something that Nikki mentioned already before me. So how do we perform online, and how do we perform as politicians online? Because we've seen so many candidates drown immediately because of a viral meme. And this is a global problem right now, a global challenge for anybody who wants to do politics. Like, how do you perform your kind of brand of political authenticity when there are no, as you mentioned a couple of places in your book, there are no safe spaces. And so everything has to be very much managed, and people have to be prepared for kind of damage control on the internet if something like this kind of nasty viral meme emerges. And so all of this takes me to the last thing, is this notion of sensationalism and scandal and emotionality. So also something that David mentioned, so populism as a strategy for the good and for the bad. I mean, we are in a place right now where we see very clearly that populism is very effective as a method, not only for right-wing populists, not only for left-wing populists, also for kind of, I would say, kind of center-minded populists. But this is, again, populist because it, in the sense that it relies so much on emotional, evocative messaging, instead of this kind of ideal of giving truth. I mean, truth is highly debatable these days. And so I would like to conclude with putting the first question out. Is filtering undemocratic, and how is it done in a reality where we have traditional news next to Substack type of news, where we have media experts, media amateurs, hashtags coming out of ordinary social media users? So how is it undemocratic? Does it make sense? And if so, how should it be done?
It's a great question. Should I make a few remarks, Jeff? Okay. That's a terrific question. And I would say part of what it points to is, to come back to Nikki's statement, is that media and politics, and I would add society, are interactive categories that are sort of pushing and constructing each other simultaneously. So that this question of filtering as undemocratic, and I'd be interested to see how people are thinking about it in Poland, in the United States has a particular valence. Like today, you know, Facebook decided not to reinstate Donald Trump. And the first I knew of it, a young conservative friend of mine in Virginia, former military, texted me and said, did you see that they didn't reinstate Trump? How can we say that we believe as a country in free speech if they won't let Donald Trump on Facebook? And this is so fascinating to me, because both it suggests how Facebook has replicated the public sphere that is governed by the Constitution, has actually hidden its, or, you know, it's not hidden, we all know it, but as we respond to it, you know, the idea of a private profit-making institution, which is what Facebook is, has receded. And that's kind of behind the curtain. And I wrote back to this friend, you know, actually, this is kind of like Walmart, because, you know, Walmart won't let people organize in unions on its property. And it's allowed to do that because it's a private corporation and they own the property. Facebook is exactly the same. This is why this isn't a First Amendment case, right? And so, but in the United States, the idea of filtering as as undemocratic and as a restraint on free speech is just intimately tied to these early internet architects who believed that they were actually building electronic communication that would supersede the public and would be freer than the public sphere that existed in that moment. I mean, think about 1970s and 1980s, right? What the political situation was in the United States. And I want to sort of extrapolate from what you're saying that I think Europeans were much savvier from the beginning to understand the surveillance capacities, not just of the internet, but of social media itself. And you know what you really see in the early Twitter activism is both that explosion of, you know, in say the Arab Spring, but also in Istanbul and Gezi Square and in Brazil, you see that explosion of hope that the internet can provide this free space that is mobile enough that it can evade the state, and a growing recognition, you know, within a matter of months, that the only reason it was possible is that governments had not yet caught up with how to use these same platforms to hobble social movements, right? So I think outside the United States, people were much savvier because they had much more intimate knowledge of what a surveillance state was and how surveillance states could turn any technology to their uses to control the population. So I think the question of filtering as undemocratic is very embedded in its particular socio-political context, and that it's sometimes at war with the idea of the internet as a place for simple friendships, right? And of course, in simple friendships, we know that actually we don't say everything we think to people. But that, you know, certainly I would say the context collapse, which is a digital phrase for that, happens in 2016 when a lot of us left Facebook because people who were actually our friends in real life were treating us so badly. And the volatility of the conversations on Facebook was so out of control that the actual exchange of views seemed ultimately undemocratic because it was clearly sort of driving us to the opposite of consensus, right? And an election is sort of a moment in which a nation reaches consensus. But in fact, that election was all about splintering publics and dividing them from each other. And of course, some of that had to do with interference from intelligence agencies from abroad, which we know now. But I want to just sort of go back and touch on a couple of other comments. One is, I actually want to say the phrase political junkies as a title was handed to me by the marketing department at Basic Books. And I would actually say to any author who is writing a book, the title is the one thing you don't get to fight about because they're the people who are selling the book, not you. That being said, once this title had come back to me, I began to find it useful in some of the ways Nikki was talking about in terms of how emotion is generated and put to use. And that too happens before the internet. And there's a moment in the book that I point to, which is Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972, in which Thompson, you know, who has written all of these sort of wacky new journalism books, many of which are obsessed with drug and alcohol consumption, is sent to cover the McGovern campaign by Rolling Stone. And and he doesn't care about politics. He actually doesn't care about politics at all, which is why Rolling Stone wants him to do it. And by about month 2 of his coverage, he's completely and totally hooked. And he discovers that he has come to need and desire that which he despises, which is this sort of intimate backstage view of how a president becomes a president. And of course, somebody like Teddy White has been writing about this for over a decade, right? But it's from the perspective, sort of like massaging objective journalism into a backstage view. Whereas for Thompson, what he's interested in is the unexpected things, the things that go wrong. And, you know, he's basically watching McGovern melt down in real time and conveying that in his articles in Rolling Stone. And, you know, he describes the final night of the campaign as this sort of death watch, and nobody knows but the people, the journalists on the plane, that McGovern is doomed. And so, and what he calls this, he says, it's like a heroin high, right? I know more about drugs and alcohol than anybody else, and politics for me now is something I'm mainlining, right? And you see this sort of period of years in which some people are saying, this is one of the most unserious ideas I've ever heard of. This is not what politics is about. Politics is about reason. Politics is about policy. Politics is about good people doing good things. And of course, Watergate is unfolding during these years. And then you have other people like Robert MacNeil. When Robert MacNeil is interviewed about his new show, which comes out of the Watergate hearings, and I may not say this in the book, but the Watergate hearings is the moment I become hooked on politics as a kid. I spend the entire summer watching the Watergate hearings. And so do millions of other Americans. That's the astonishing thing. Nobody thinks this is going to work to broadcast them live. And instead it becomes the most popular television show in the United States. And so when MacNeil decides to take this to the next level, he's doing an interview and he says, this show is for political junkies, right? Now, this is one of the most respectable newsmen. You know, he's worked for NBC, he's worked for the BBC, he's worked for the CBC, he's worked in every possible broadcast medium, and he is luring an audience by saying, this is for you, political junkies. It's not for everybody. I think what the book shows is that actually political junkies goes from a sort of contested idea to unwittingly embracing all of us as politics increasingly becomes a source of entertainment as much as anything else. So that's really why a title that I wasn't actually so sure I wanted, in a way, helped me rethink one of the major threads of the book. And finally, I want to get to some of Nikki's comments, which is the idea of media as a challenge to politics. And I think that's actually really, really smart. Because in fact, by taking people to the backstage of politics, media, first more mainstream, but then increasingly alternative media and digital media are saying, this is how you make a better democracy, is by telling people everything they need to know. And to come back to your point, Helena, in the most unfiltered way possible. And then you get 2006 and George Allen's macaca moment, which, by the way, macaca is a very bad word. Do not use it lightly, in which George Allen refers to a South Asian man with that racial slur, and he's taping it, and he's there to tape it. He has been there. He's been sent there by the opponent's campaign to tape Allen until he says something truly awful, which everybody knows Allen is going to say, because Allen has been saying and doing deeply racist things for over 15 years, and no mainstream journalist will report it. And so this kid actually gets it live, takes it back to the campaign. They put it up on this infant service called YouTube. But what really drives it is Talking Points Memo puts it up and spreads it through the legal blogosphere. And Allen's campaign dies by millions and millions and millions of little tiny cuts. And this was a man who was supposed to go on to be president of the United States. and his political career comes to an end at that moment. And that's the time, and this is like 2 years post Howard Dean, that people say, well, here's this technology that we thought was going to be so great, and we thought it was going to be so democratic, but is it going to be okay for someone to be taken out of a race, without any kind of procedure or proceeding by a viral video? Is that really going to be okay? One of the most outspoken people about this is a man named Larry Craig, a senator from Idaho, whose own career is destroyed by the internet when he's arrested in a men's room, supposedly for soliciting a police officer. Again, that's the kind of thing that journalists didn't cover. It wasn't respectable. It wasn't decent. You let the voters decide who they wanted to vote for. Bloggers cover it. And so what you get from alternative media on the internet is something that they've drawn from earlier alternative media, which is everything's fair. Just give people the information and let them decide. Don't editorialize. Just tell them what they need to know, right? And so that it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because actually all those journalists shouldn't have been covering up what George Allen was doing and saying. But it's a bad thing because actually when you let the people decide, you then create the opportunity for a whole new kind of political consultant who is putting stuff out there that isn't true. Let the people decide whether it's true or not. That's not my job, right? So I do think that whole question of media as a challenge to politics, and particularly the idea that there is not just an insider political establishment, but an insider media establishment that is protecting those people, gets broken open in that moment. I think the question of populism that you're raising, David, is an extraordinarily important one, and you're right. The meaning of populism changes over time. The most basic thing we do as historians is change over time. And I'll never forget, after Rick Perlstein read my book, and he sent me this frantic email saying, I don't know why you're using populism in this way. I'm a populist, and I'm not like any of these people. And I thought, well, that is exactly the change in what populism has become. But that was inherent in populism from the beginning. That someone like Tom Watson goes from being actually a progressive man of the people to realizing that that's not going to win him elections. And he becomes a raving racist, who is also still a man of the people, right? So I think one of the things populism does is that it's a container for a certain kind of not just political behavior, but a certain kind of investment in the people rather than institutions that can be pushed in any direction that you want to push it in, depending on how good you are at staking out a position. I mean, the idea, for example, that Donald Trump was a populist would have been absurd in the 1890s, right? I mean, William Jennings Bryan would, have flipped his lid. But the fact that his followers believe he's a populist because he appears to care nothing about institutions and appears to care only about them, that's what makes him a populist, right? So I don't think it's exactly an empty category. I think it's a really complex category where a lot of different tendencies are intersecting, and they start to intersect more rapidly with social media. So I'll stop there.
So I think that there's a really interesting connection between this question about populism and this question about filtering. Because I think when we think about populism comparatively, as it's appearing all over the world, one characteristic is, in fact, this emptying of social institutions and social practices and cultural norms between the leader and the general population. Mm-hmm. And the leader says, I speak for the people. The people identify with the leader as the person who speaks the truth. And all the social practices that usually mediate between the leader and the people are being emptied out. So like a great deal in your book, there's a subtlety in the analysis. You're both pointing to the very positive power of the new media and of alternative media, including I.F. Stone. And I have to add that as a high school kid, I read I.F. Stone weekly. And it was thrilling and it was addictive. And calling me then and now a political junkie for the thrill is probably appropriate. But nevertheless, this kind of opting out of standard institutional ways of doing things is characteristic of the moment. And you describe it very seriously, but filtering is actually an alternative to that, is an anecdote to that. I mean, I just learned today, as you spoke, Claire, that Facebook decided to keep Trump off. I mean, that's really, really interesting that this institution is capable of, is willing to do that at this point. It's like 2 chairs for filtering, perhaps we might say. So I'm kind of intrigued about that relationship and intrigued, and the idea of populism, I think, applies to the United States, but applies everywhere. And the link that you make between new media and the ascendance of populism very much applies not only to the United States, but many other places. Which
Can I jump?
Go ahead, David.
No, I was just going.
I want to actually bring a member of the audience's question in, but you go ahead and then I'll bring it in.
Okay, well, I saw a question in the chat. Maybe this is the one you mean about, populism versus democracy. Is populism a threat to democracy? Which is, gets at all these things we're talking about. And I think there's sort of in the general usage, a tendency to conflate these concepts, both in a way invest power in the people. There's an egalitarian thrust to it. And we even use the term democratic, YouTube is democratic. It really has nothing to do with democracy one way or the other. Maybe if we're talking about a media sphere, that term might apply. But it all put me in mind of the work of John Lukács, the historian, conservative Eastern European emigre who died just a couple of years ago and wrote several books along this theme. And he had this kind of conservative, like Henry Adams-esque, kind of George Kennan-esque decline of the West sort of view. But in his view, democracy had curdled or been corrupted into populism decades ago, like with the rise of television and public opinion polling, so that it was this constant act of politicians sort of slavishly chasing after these popular impulses, as opposed to democracy, which suggests something more of a place for institutions and established practices and norms. Now, democracy itself, sometimes people juxtapose with the idea of a republic, which is, has more connotations of order and elites playing a role. And I think, a lot of these questions just get at that intersection. So with filtering or with gatekeeping in media, we're all for letting more voices in until it becomes chaotic and the voices are QAnon and the voices are, the conspiracy theories and the crazies. And this question of how we regulate it, I think everybody, left, right, center, sort of puts stock in both of these impulses for a more egalitarian public sphere and political sphere, but also for restraints that give us reason to debate, that give us a chance to work out our differences in a sort of civil, constructive way. And clearly that has been thrown up in the air, partly because of these new technologies, and we don't know how to reassemble it in a productive way.
Well, I think that's right, David. And, I want to bring in this question from Jack Anderson more specifically, which is 6 corporations control 90% of the media. You don't see that as a threat. Yes, it's a terrible threat. And I would actually recommend, if you have the time, to buy Amy Klobuchar's new book on anti-monopoly. Because one of the things she does very well is she tells the history of monopolistic practices and the history of political attempts to fight them. And then she demonstrates how that has actually fallen apart and why it's fallen apart. And part of the reason is that, the FCC basically has no teeth anymore. But the other thing is that the affordances, media affordances, have altered to such a radical degree that old laws don't necessarily apply to them. And so, when I was thinking about your first book, David, Nixon Shadow, which, for those of you who haven't read it, the title, of course, refers to the idea that Nixon lost the election in 1960 because in the debate with Kennedy, his beard was too big, and he looked evil and menacing. And Nixon, on the one hand, tries to rehabilitate his media image and pioneers actually the use of advertising, commercial advertising. He doesn't really pioneer it. Eisenhower had, but he develops it to a degree that had not been developed so far. But he never stopped struggling with the media, right? And one of the things I think you see with social media is politicians don't struggle with it. They simply look for another workaround. And social media has so many workarounds that, in fact, the Trump strategy was flood the zone with shit, right? Which I actually think is Steve Bannon's words. But that if you just keep dumping stuff out there in this voluminous way, what you need to be able to do is overwhelm your opponent, not necessarily tell a more persuasive or convincing story. And that's really different from what we're seeing in the 60s and 70s, where a politician like Nixon believes that the media are his enemy and that he is the outsider guy. And yet, at the same time, he's got people like Roger Ailes saying, yeah, but you can also control these guys. And let me show you how. And this is how it works, right? So I think that's incredibly important. And I would also say, Jack, yes, it's terrible that 6 corporations control 90% of the media. And part of what's wrong about that is that the diversity of our media has diminished dramatically. We have very little in the way of local news. And what it means is that when Facebook does something like say, no, we're actually going to ban Donald Trump forever, they are interfering in politics because, the vast majority of Americans get all their news from social media. And it's of course what makes it possible to fold in disinformation with actually well-reported stories and have them be the same. But it's also actually a problem. If in fact the vast majority of political messaging is happening on social media, if you lock someone out of social media, they can't compete. And we need to think about that as a problem that's not just about Trump, that's about the future of politics more generally, because actually it really could happen to any candidate under other circumstances, right?
I'll just make a quick response to that question too, which is clearly it's not a good thing when there's such limited ownership of media. On the other hand, I don't think there has been a time in human history, or place where, like in America today, you have more easy exposure to such a range of ideological and other takes on politics. So the notion that kind of used to be fashionable in the 70s, consolidation, we're getting this kind of ideological constriction, I think has just been shown to be false.
Mm-hmm.
I'm this point that Nicole raised about identity and attachment, I think is extraordinarily important. I think it's terribly important for appraising where we are, and also for appraising which ain't good, and also appraising whether there's a way out. And I'm thinking of this, Thompson, the story that Claire told us about Thompson. Like, we're all addicted to this, and it's not just we people who used to read things like I.F. Stone, but it's everyone now. And it defines, for so many people, unreflectively, it defines who they are. It defines whether or not they will take a vaccine to save their lives. This is an extraordinary moment, and I'd like to hear more about that. And I'm also thinking about Poland, because it seems to me that the politics in Poland is, to some extent, about policy and whether there's going to be democracy or not. It's my two countries, Poland and the United States. That's a pressing question. But it also an issue is who we are, and people vote, consume media, have a sense of themselves as political junkies.
Yeah, I would say on the identity front that it's not just that people are addicted, it's that they're invested, right? Because their identity is on the line depending on what is happening in politics. And, I'm not sure it's unique necessarily in US history. If you think about the ways that people were attached familially to their political parties, and the political party they voted for determined what kind of news they had access to, because you would buy the Democratic or the Republican paper, and how they saw themselves in the world. And the idea of a cross-partisan relationship was sort of odd to think about. I'm thinking in like the late 19th century. And politics was very central in people's lives, but not the way that it is now. And I think that's where the access to information that David was talking about, and just the inescapability of it, the flood of it. I mean, this is something that we haven't had to reckon with before. If before the problem was trying to find information, now it's trying to sort out the good information from the bad information, and not having great signposts for that, because if our identity is leading the way, then we're likely to follow that instead of some sort of objective or academic.
And Facebook is giving us the directions.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And networks of authority that Facebook creates, which also becomes really interesting. Like, who do you trust? And so these are economies of trust and networks, in a way that's just fascinating. But I do think that as long as your identity is on the line, this is why I'm not super optimistic about this changing in a productive way anytime soon. As long as your identity is on the line in these things, it's going to be a fight to the death. And I'm not sure that it was ever, I'm not sure that elections were ever really about consensus. I think that they were always like, there's a winning side and there's a losing side. But the stakes of winning and losing, I think, have changed because of this identity-based politics.
Well, and I think what you're saying about that, Nicole, is absolutely right. And it makes me think about this sort of current viral controversy that has, of course, been ginned up by culture warriors and ALEC and so on around critical race theory. And having recently become briefly engaged in Barry Weiss's Substack on this issue, and having gotten a lot of mail subsequently, one of the things that it really clarified is exactly what you're saying. What are the stakes? What the stakes are for many white people is who gets to say who a white person is. And no, you don't get to come into my child's school and give a training and say, this is what white people have done, and this is what white people have to reckon with. in a racist country. You don't get to say that because my child is not that kind of white person and I'm not that kind of white person and I don't have anything to do with this. And so some of the most vicious conflicts erupt around the protection of identities that people simply take for granted and have made a whole, they've actually got a bunch of filters already on about what they're going to let in and what they're not going to let in about whiteness and what that's connected to. And yes, that's a huge part of the emotionality, but it's also something you can track right back to the 1950s, Nikki, where you're an expert, where you have people like Clarence Mannion, who are taking very, very local forms of populist conservatism and reaching out across the nation and saying, yes, this is how we feel in Texas. And oh my goodness, this is how you feel in California. And this is how you feel in Wisconsin. And that's all happening without an internet at all. It's happening with radio and television shows and newsletters, all of which are being supported by major donors, and that's where I would also come back to some of the questions David has raised about populism, which is there's populism and there's populism, but populism always presents itself as authentic, regardless of where it's coming from, right? And what that authenticity means at different times has something to do with, whether the technology is cheap enough for anybody to use and whether the affordances themselves are available to anybody. So in the chapter Electronic Democracy, one of the things I talk about are how actually local governments began to experiment with using this very, very early internet connection to make more democratic decisions about how their cities would work. And they begin to sort of bring people into that, but it also indicates, yes, you can use this to organize people around anything, really.
Well, and that's what's so interesting is that, this question about whether filters are democratic or using the word democratic for any of these things, I'm not sure that the structures themselves give us the answer to that, because you could also point to, as Kathleen Ballou does, the way that white power groups were using LibertyNet in the 1980s and the 1990s in order to organize and make connections in order to pursue deeply anti-liberal, anti-democratic ends. And so it is true that one of the affordances is that more people have access to this sort of publishing platform or what have you, but how they use it then becomes determinative of whether we think it's democratic, whether we think it's good or bad, and all those things.
And unfortunately, one of the chapters that got cut from the book because there was a word length that I could not exceed actually talked about how internet knowledge then sort of fed back into the mainstream media atmosphere. And one of the things I looked at that I had to pull out was the author Joyce Milton, who writes one of the first anti-Hillary books. And she writes it in 1995, 1996. And what she's using for much of her research is a internet bulletin board that still exists called freerepublic.com. And the people who are on it are known as freepers, right? And so when I began to sort of figure this out was when I was looking, and let me just tell you, you write a book like this, you really value the internet because everything's still on it. But it was a C-SPAN telecast of Joyce Milton giving a talk to a conservative group. And they would ask her questions. Well, how do you know that Hillary, used to beat up Bill all the time? And she would say, well, I got it from the internet. And it was like this kind of authority claim. And they'd be like, oh, it's on the internet. Well, then, and so the idea that things that were on the internet were actually the truest of truthy true things was this sort of early perception in the 1990s, but then it feeds back into a book. And a book is a kind of authority that in the age of the internet actually is an enhanced form of knowledge. It's like, for those who are not internet believers, well, it's on the internet. Oh, but it's in a book. it was published in a book. And so you begin to see this sort of cross-fertilization of conspiracism and misinformation from alternative media back into the mainstream media sphere where it actually has power and authority.
I wanted to chip in here, if I may.
I was going to say something
okay.
that you should. So go ahead.
Okay, yeah, because you told me I'm the honorary representative of elsewhere. So I'm coming in from elsewhere, meaning not the United States. And I wanted to add one thing or one thought. Perhaps the question of filtering being undemocratic be slightly switched to more of a tunnel vision. And so it's not so much about filtering, but having kind of tunnel vision in general. And this is what those different echo chambers allow or strengthen. But another thing I wanted to pinpoint here, coming from elsewhere, is that it is really important how or by whom media is owned and how media is consolidated. And just by looking at the historical numbers of newspapers and magazines, they've been in decline everywhere, very much so in the States, the UK and Poland that I've been doing research on. And this is a major change, very much linked to what you just mentioned. You don't see these titles on the newsstand. They're not common ground, just because you can say, but there are so many more outlets on the internet, but this is not the same, because you will not likely see them in one place as this option that you have to choose from, and you're aware of them. You will likely not be aware of most of news outlets that are not catering to your particular interests. And of course, there's a political underbelly here, especially burning in Poland right now, where a major publisher of regional press that was until recently owned by a German company was recently bought by a major state-owned oil company in Poland. And right now you're seeing editors-in-chief being fired and replaced by people favored by the government. And this is happening right now. So media ownership is extremely important. And just by claiming that you can replace all those outlets and all these spaces for journalists to the internet, to Substack, to all those different new media where they can earn their pennies, this is not the same thing, not just because it's a different outlet, but because people don't see it as this kind of general space, one single space where you can see the different opinions being out in the open.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one really good example of this, I had the pleasure of listening to Edward Snowden over the weekend at the UMass conference honoring the 50 years of the Pentagon Papers. And they had Snowden in conversation with Daniel Ellsberg. And it was really about whistleblowing. But one of the things Snowden talked about is the importance of journalism in the age of the internet. And he said, you know, one of the things that was important to him was to get his information to real journalists who would vet it and would make decisions that he did not feel he was qualified to make, not just around who was going to be hurt by it, that going through it to remove questions of national security, but to actually make sense of what was in this huge document dump as a story, which is what journalists do best. And he not, you know, obliquely compared it to the WikiLeaks dumps, right? Where WikiLeaks is on this sort of old model of like, get all the information out there, let the people decide. And what Snowden was saying is actually, it's not about letting the people decide. It's about the person who has the documents making a decision to put it all out there without any context, any expert knowledge, and so on. And that's really not okay, you know? And I think in that, we actually see some of the techniques that can be used against democracy, that exactly dumping information, dumping unfiltered, contradictory, emotion-driven information into the public sphere is part of what often makes people unable to think and to actually say, we need one strong authoritarian figure to take control of all of this and make it stop, right?
So I'm looking at you and also at the clock. We're coming to the end. And I'm thinking of Poland and the United States and these propensities that are shared in both countries, where I think it's safe to say, and Helena will correct me if I'm wrong, that Poland has sort of tipped very closely, definitively to the other side in the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. There are people valiantly still struggling, and they may have a chance, but something is fundamentally broken. The United States hasn't tipped yet, but our discussion has mostly been highlighting why everything is so threatening here and has been decisive there. And I'm thinking like, okay, so this whole thing started with alternatives. Alternatives, if we take the book, it starts with I.F. Stone, who needs to get a job, but also who's presenting a very, very different, interesting take on what's going on in the world, and correcting things in some fundamental way. So how do we correct things now? So I think that Claire just highlighted one aspect, and that is some sort of traditional conventional journalism plays an important role. But I'd like to hear what Claire thinks about, and the book ends on a positive note, but doesn't give us much reason, doesn't give us much material to substantiate it. So if we could just all discuss briefly what developments we think are more positive as a way of, so that we can think our way through this and maybe out of this situation that we're in.
So I'm going to say something really weird. The first is lawsuits. I have never appreciated the importance of lawsuits since I have seen, people like Lynn Wood and the other folks around Trump and the news organizations being sued by the voting machines company. Not that it will persuade the most hardline partisans. I think it's fascinating that Newsmax has put a statement out there saying what we said wasn't true. We had no evidence for it, blah, blah, blah. I sent it to a Trumpy friend of mine, and he said, it doesn't matter. That's the kind of thing, they had to say it because of the court, right? So I think there is a kind of tipping where people hang on to their views so closely that there's no amount of factual evidence that can move them away from the conversation that they're addicted to. The other weird thing I'm going to say is I am following Liz Cheney very, very closely right now. I've been doing some writing about Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney and I have zero in common politically, and yet she is sticking to her guns about the so-called big lie being a big lie, right? And she is at present, at least temporarily, torching her career in order to tell the truth within the Republican Party about what happened around that election. And I think the question is going to be whether the Republican Party is actually strong enough to simply silence this dissent, to marginalize those people, or whether some other kind of political formation, some other kind of conservatism is going to emerge from this rift. And because, I actually don't think Trumpism is very strong, ideologically or in electoral terms. But the question is it strong enough to silence dissent within the Republican Party, or will those Republicans who are dissenting, that minority, in the end win? And a lot of that will have to do with the rest of us, frankly. It will have to do with the rest of us being willing to say, God, I hate everything Liz Cheney stands for, but I need to embrace her right now because she's telling the truth and she's doing the right thing. And that's something that practically all of us have forgotten how to do in the last 10 years. So.
I've been trying. and looking at the nodding heads, I think we all have, but actually how to do that consequentially has been a challenge. So I guess time is up. And I really regret that we can't talk further about this. The book is fascinating. I think that the story you tell in granular details, each detail is more interesting than the one before it. It's really, from I.F. Stone to where we are now. The tragedy you tell about, I think that the book is a tragic story. It's people seeking alternatives and creating and making matters worse as they seek alternatives, which there's a drama in it that is compelling and requires that we not only think further, but figure out ways to act. And I guess I'm going to close on that point. That I suppose what I should say is thank you very much to the panelists, and especially thank you very much, Claire, for writing the book and for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for this fun midday celebration.
Yes. Take care, everyone.